All right. Hi, welcome. My name is Nigel Smith, and I am the movies news editor at People Magazine. And thank you, everyone, so much for joining our post, How to Survive a Plague Watch Party Q&A, sponsored by, of course, IFC Films, with director David France and maybe Miss Peppermint. We're having some trouble reaching her at the moment, but hopefully she will surprise us with a grand entrance. So as everyone on Zoom will see right now, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please jot down your questions in your forum for David and Peppermint, and I'll get to most of them during the discussion. So now, as everyone here knows, we're here mainly to discuss the amazing 2012 documentary, How to Survive a Plague, David France's award-winning film, tracing the grassroots efforts of activist groups during the AIDS crisis. And the film's increased relevance today in the wake of the pandemic that we're all living through, and the inspiring, urgent activism of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, the film won Best Documentary at the Gotham Awards and was also nominated for the Best Documentary Oscar at the 85th Academy Awards. If you haven't yet seen it, and I hope you have, please watch it this Pride Month on IFC Films, and it's streaming for free. You can watch it on Apple TV and Amazon Prime. So now on to our guests. David France. David France is a journalist who's covered the AIDS crisis from its very beginnings before going on to documentary film. He's a former Newsweek editor, and he's been published by The New Yorker, GQ, New York Magazine, and many, many other outlets. France, who's also a published author, has also directed, as many of you have probably seen, The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson, an incredible 2017 documentary about the trailblazing transgender activist. And his next film, which I hope you all will watch, is a documentary named Welcome to Chechnya. And it centers on activists risking their lives amid the ongoing anti-LGBTQ persecution in the Russian Republic of Chechnya. The film premieres on HBO in a matter of days on June 30th. All right. So David, how are you? Are you in New York?
Yes, I am. I'm in the East Village, stuck at home like everybody else.
How have you been riding out the pandemic?
Well, I've been busy, as you mentioned, launching a new film and have started work on yet another. So I'm keeping as busy as a person might from the comforts of their own home.
And you're also doing something that I'm sure was unexpected going into this year. You've had to revisit this film in multiple interviews. I saw you speak with Variety and Deadline and other outlets, just given its increased relevance. And obviously the reason we're talking about it today in the wake of Pride Month and of course, the pandemic that I previously mentioned. For you, what is it like for you to have to revisit it in the wake of everything that's going on?
Well, you know, anybody who lived through that pandemic has revisited it just by nature of having to experience another pandemic. And it makes you wonder whether or not you learned lessons the last time around that empower you or you know, steel you up for this one. So we've all really returned to our own memories and histories going through this. But you're right, I've returned to this film in a fresh way, and I've watched it with fresh eyes to see the ways that it offers a kind of a blueprint for you know, getting through, for interfacing with science and scientists, interfacing with experts at a time when expertise is really the key tool to get through a crisis like this. And so what I find from that story is the encouragement that it is possible to somehow engage with your community of experts in ways that are productive and helpful and can both insist upon urgency, which we've certainly been seeing, but also morality and kindness and humanity. And you know, there are so many lessons to be learned from AIDS activists, and those are among the top.
And going off the lessons that the film teaches you, what do you think the film can teach us about how to translate fear of that era into the fear that we're living through right now, into action come the fall with the election and a possible spike in COVID cases?
That's a really good question. You know what ACT UP and AIDS activists taught us was how to take anger and move anger into action.
Mhm.
And uh, and we for the longest time in the beginning of this pandemic didn't see that anger, and I think the anger finally began to coalesce. I know it did after the murder of George Floyd,
Mhm.
and what we've seen since then is the kind of forward-looking, progressive, engaged sort of activism that carries with it a brand new vision for a brand new America coming out of this. And so I don't think it's fear necessarily, but really a kind of a rage, a kind of an empowering sort of an anger that moves us into these stances that can have the power to bring us to a new place.
And as you're describing, it's really impossible not to draw parallels between the activism in this film and the activism of the Black Lives Matter movement, and its remarkable recent surge worldwide. Did you foresee this movement taking hold the way that it has, especially in the midst of a pandemic, given that you've now lived through two?
Well, you know, when COVID first descended on us, I was very despairing.
Yeah.
I was despairing for our America. You know, I was despairing for our for humanity itself, for civilization itself. Somebody once asked me if I was uh, worried that New York be would ever come back,
Yeah.
and I'm not worried about our city. Like there's there's the city has been through many challenges, and it has a sort of spirit uh, uh, and power that will survive anything. What I was worried about was the whole country, the notion of America, the experiment of America,
Mhm.
and it wasn't until the arrival of this uh, manifestation of the movement for Black Lives that I realized that there was a powerful idea afoot that would take the opportunity of this pandemic, both the tragedy and the opportunity of it, to coalesce around a brand new idea for the country. And I think that's what we're seeing on the streets today. I think they're not only carrying a vision, but they're carrying a potential to get us there, uh,
Mhm.
and that's very heartening. And it's given me a lot of hope. It's really kind of repaired my psyche in a way.
Hmm.
And I have been a student of the Black Lives Matter movement since its inception,
Um,
both watching it from afar and joining in the protests. Um, what I had not seen was how accomplished they had become in creating the necessary organization,
mhm.
structure, the inroads into even the smallest cities and towns in the country that are now manifesting in demonstrations and celebrations and this kind of pride in America,
Yeah.
that the America of the mind, the America of the imagination, that is forward looking and and I don't know, it's so full of promise. I can't tell you how suddenly I went from months and months, it seemed, of being just despairing to suddenly having a great deal of hope.
That's great. Well, going off the inroads that you just mentioned, AIDS activists in the 80s, they didn't have Twitter, they didn't have Instagram or the internet to
Right?
rally and gain support in the way that is so incredibly invaluable, as you mentioned, to the Black Lives Matter movement and how they've just managed to gain foot in recent months. How different do you think the AIDS crisis would have looked had we had those resources at the time?
It's
Do you know?
almost impossible to imagine, Nigel. Come
It is,
on.
right?
Like,
Yeah.
what was life like before the internet? I lived most of my life before the internet, and I can't remember it. I just can't imagine it.
Yeah.
It's this. At first, and I used to say when I would talk to people after they watched How to Survive a Plague, I used to say that the internet undermined the kind of movement that ACT UP started. ACT UP was a movement that was born of a group of people in a room, and they kept returning to that room, individuals among individuals, pulling their voices together in a single way.
Mhm.
And I used to say that I thought that what Facebook and other social media gathering places did was to lie to us about our sense of community, our friends, our circle of power. It in fact enveloped us in bubbles that made it less likely for people to see the need to move out of those rooms and into the general public and to make your point in on larger stages. But I think what I think I've been proved wrong. I mean, that's what I think happened. I think what was going on that could only be seen inside bubbles has now burst out as a full force of political power and political persuasion and grassroots organizing in the way that we haven't seen it in the longest time.
Now, the film itself, how long did it take you? I read that it took you 20 years to really put together from you know, first moments of inception to execution.
Well, I don't know where you read that because it didn't take 20 years.
Okay, good.
You could say it took 30 years from the first hint of a plague
Yeah.
to the arrival of my film. But no, it was the film ends in 1996 when the effective medication came out,
Mm-hmm.
and it was about 15 years after that I felt compelled to go back and look at the plague pre-96
Yeah.
and see what lessons we can learn from it, see what good came out of the plague years of AIDS. And I began the work then. So it was probably a 3-year process, start to finish. It began, and I don't know if you know this, but it began as a book project.
Yeah, you released a book.
Well, not right away because
Yeah.
I was working on the book proposal in 2008 and 2009, and developed a proposal that one takes around town the way one does to see what publishing house would commission you to do the book. And just as I was making those rounds, the economic collapse happened that imperiled print media and legacy media entirely. Newspapers became money-losing operations and lacked a certain sort of economic viability. And publishing houses had the same problem. Publishing houses started collapsing in 2009 and folding in on one another and merging and paring down their lists. I couldn't get anybody to publish the book. So, and I couldn't, as a freelance magazine writer at the time for New York Magazine, I couldn't even get like regular periodical journalism published. It was that bad in 2009. And so I thought I'll do what people with no money do. I'll put a documentary on a credit card because nobody can stop you from putting a documentary on a credit card. So I started work then just on my own, thinking I would try to make sense of that old archival footage that I had learned so much about when I was doing my research, and then see if I could find a new way to tell the story, at least a new way for me. I had never made a film before, although I'd been a huge fan and consumer of documentary films. So I was really forced into trying this new approach for me because there was just nothing else to do. And that's what produced this film.
I want to say thank God for that, because now we have this incredible document. Um, just making the film, I can't imagine how difficult it must have been for you, given the relationships you forged with so many of the subjects, many of them who passed away. Oh, do we have Peppermint?
Looks like it.
Nope. Oh,
Yes, we
hello.
do. Hello. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Excellent. I'm sorry I'm so late. I thought this was at 9:30.
Oh, no. Well, then technically you're actually early.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, then I'm going to give my short intro for Miss Peppermint, given she's here and looking gorgeous as always. So Miss Peppermint is a trans icon of all trades. She's an actress, singer, television personality, drag queen, and incredible activist. Peppermint became popular as a figure as the runner-up of the 9th season of RuPaul's Drag Race, and then she went on to make history as the first out trans woman to play a lead role on Broadway in the Go-Go's inspired musical Head Over Heels. Now on TV, she's also made incredible appearances on Pose, Saturday Night Live, and a number of other shows. And as an activist, Miss Peppermint has been a vital voice in the Black Lives Matter movement, engaging in enlightening conversations with fellow Drag Race alum Bob the Drag Queen on their ongoing YouTube panels. And they most recently, and I recommend you all watch this if you haven't, hosted the first annual Black Queer Town Hall. And next, Peppermint's going to be hosting It Gets Better, a digital pride experience, which will be able to view on YouTube and other platforms.
Woo, that was plenty.
Welcome, Miss Peppermint. So have you and David ever met in person, or is this your first impromptu date?
It is our first date, and I'm so excited.
It's a setup date. It's really nice. Nice to meet you, Peppermint.
It's so nice to meet you too.
Now, Peppermint, are you also self-isolating in New York City like David?
I sure am.
And how's that?
I'm going to get a pillow from my couch as I tell you. It has been decent. Obviously, I've pretty much experienced every range of emotions that one can experience in their apartment at quarantine, but I know it's all for the best. And I'm proud of what we've done in New York City in terms of the response. Nothing's perfect, but I do think that we've done as good a job as to be expected, especially considering other parts of the country are having different outcomes. Yeah. And so I'm feeling pretty good. It's given me the time to focus on certain things and create the Black Queer Town Hall.
That's awesome. Now I can recall first seeing this film at Sundance and walking out of the theater shaken, overwhelmed, but incredibly inspired by what I'd watched. And Peppermint, I'm just curious what your first reaction was to David's film and what impact it had on you.
My first reaction was pretty much the same thing. I was so emotionally moved by the content, by the depth of the stories, and then my air conditioner's on. I hope you don't mind that. It's quite hot today in New York City. And so I was obviously moved as an audience member the way that I think it was intended. And then I remember feeling such a connection to the personal stories in the film, but also the movement in general. And I'm saying this as someone who has been very concerned, if not considered myself an advocate for AIDS and HIV education and prevention for many years. And so I've been in this space for a while, but it was really, the movie could be the movie is called How to Survive a Plague. The movie is also how to be a really effective activist, because that's what I was really learning from this film. And I said to myself, this was, even though like the grain of the picture is obviously quite early, I can't believe how much footage there is. And, for an age when we didn't have cell phone cameras, it seems like there was coverage of everything. Obviously, that's just my perspective. I'm sure that David would say that's probably not true. I don't know how many hours of footage there was to comb through, but I was so um, impressed from a filmmaking standpoint of how we relied less on the interviews and talking heads and more on actual footage for the story. And I thought that was brilliant.
David, were you surprised by the amount of footage that you uncovered, or did you really go into it knowing that you had all those resources available to you for the film?
Well, well, thank you for that, Peppermint. I knew that footage existed. I knew that it was being recorded as it was happening, and I knew it because I was a journalist on the ground working in print, covering the work that the ACT UP activists were doing. And their allies were doing. There were cameras everywhere. It was the very, very first movement that had access to affordable consumer grade recording equipment. The camcorder was invented and introduced in 1982, and HIV was introduced in 1981. So they were kind of dual pandemics taking hold, and by 1986 and 87 when ACT UP formed, it was already plain that the mainstream media was not covering what was going on in the community. Everybody was denying. They were paying no attention to it, and the ACT UP and the activists said, "Then we will create our own record." There's the idea that we're all going to die of this, and we don't want any of this to be lost to history. And so that's why they started doing all that recording. And it really was, as Peppermint said, really all over the place. It was, even if when you watch the film, you can see in just about every frame, other people holding cameras. And that's how I started bringing in the footage. I found one collection, and then I would identify the people who were shooting in those frames and find them and bring in their collection and identify the other people, the other shooters. And ultimately it's footage from over 30 individual independent videographers who were doing this work for various reasons. Some of them just to document, some of them to do kind of alternative news coverage, some of them as artists, just making this record and making sure that that they left behind this record for the world to see. And I brought in my effort to tell the story as a kind of a verite story, like as though I had conceived of it and shot it myself. I brought in 800 hours of this archival footage so that I could see, for example, like Peter Staley is like one of the main characters in the film, and I would in that 800 hours I just studied it to find Peter Staley, and then I put all the Peter Staley together in one place, and I brought all the grunts Frank Ruta together in one place, and I started just combining this footage to see how they interacted over those years. It was really over almost 10 years that this footage was shot. And to see how much of their stories I could really chronicle. Bob Rafsky's another person. I realized you could see Bob Rafsky going from healthy and vital and powerful to sick and frail and dying and not afraid. Bob was never afraid, but he despaired at the end, and you could see that despairing, and you could see him express his concern for his young daughter who he knew he was leaving behind. And that was all in that footage, not all in one individual camera operator's footage, but when you combined that work, you could find that story. I'm sure that same thing could be done with cell phone footage. But where do people save their cell phone footage, and how much of that gets lost? How much
it's
of that
in the cloud?
And it's in the cloud, and when I die, nobody's going to go into my cloud to try to find what I've been shooting. Whereas the stuff that people put on VHS tapes and high 8 tapes and 3/4-inch U-matic tapes and all of the different formats that were recorded back then. Those are like big physical chunky things that people slid under their beds, or they put in their attics, or that they put on the top shelf in their closets. And that stuff sat there all those years waiting for somebody to come and preserve it and to try and find the history as it was lived at those times. That's what it allowed me to do.
It's incredible. Well, as the film documents, there's large swaths of the population who didn't seem to value the lives of LGBTQ minorities at the time. Do you feel that's the case now? This is directed at both of you, with how COVID disproportionately affects Black and Brown communities and the lack of the government really acknowledging that fact.
Absolutely. I mean, plagues are never democratic. They always, these microscopic organisms can reveal the worst in society. And what HIV taught us was how thorough the hatred for queer people was at the time. And what COVID has taught us is that things we actually knew, obviously, but it revealed in this undeniable way how marginalized in a healthcare setting Black and Brown people are in America and always have been in America, and how the different treatments that are afforded to African Americans in hospital settings than for other Americans. And HIV laid bare that disparity in a way that created the impetus for and power for the queer movement that suddenly saw advances on civil rights grounds and ultimately gave us marriage equality. And what I think we're seeing now, hopefully, is the movement that took foot and has taken foot and is marching now for Black lives is going to have the same fundamental transformative remaking of America around a brand new vision.
I agree. I think that for everything that COVID...
I can't hear Peppermint.
Oh, you can't hear me?
Can you hear her, David? Oh no. David, can you hear Peppermint?
No, Peppermint's a little bit on the,
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Now you sound great.
Do it like this. I take out my headphones. I'm so sorry about that. For everything that COVID has exposed in terms of, I guess it was the double function is that in addition to taking so many people from us globally, which can't be minimized at all, we were left with the realization, the very clear, non-shrouded reality that of the disparities in the healthcare system, and basically the effects of, it was almost like the tea leaves were, all of a sudden everything that had been steeping in racism in America was now laid bare. The healthcare system, the police system, the prison industrial complex, the legislation and policies. Aunt Jemima, NASCAR, the Confederate flag, statues. It's like there's nowhere you can turn. I recently worked on Broadway. They're having a reorganization. The Oscars just announced. Like, there's so many different things that are suddenly atoning, which would never, I do not believe would have ever happened had we not been in the situation that we're in with COVID. Yeah. And so while it exposed, it took way too many people from us. But it simultaneously exposed the areas that were in desperate need of improvement or abolishment. And it also provided a sort of conduit of energy and connection, because so many of us, like you said in the beginning, we've been sitting in our houses watching Tiger King, where I don't even think Tiger King would have been as much of a pop culture phenomenon had it been released today.
Yeah.
Like as in like during this week, as opposed to a couple months ago. And so it really allowed us the energy and the frustration or whatever it took to take to the streets and continue in the streets. And so I think that's one of the outcomes from COVID.
Yeah. Now, Peppermint, you were in 2019, you were at the October oral arguments for the landmark Supreme Court ruling on LGBTQ employment discrimination. Could you describe the room at the time that you were there and your reaction to their recent ruling protecting LGBT employees? And if you ever saw this day actually coming?
Well, I knew that there would be a decision naturally, because they, they were there.
Yeah.
So I guess it didn't become very real to me until going to the oral arguments, which was an honor and a blessing. And as many things as I can say about this country, it is a rare opportunity for anyone to sit in on any Supreme Court case. That was very apparent to me. It is rife with tradition. Mm-hmm. And I felt like I was in Catholic church, standing up and sitting down all the time. Every time a judge came in or a justice came in. But it was, I felt like I was there to behold a piece of history in the making. I was in the Supreme Court myself, my Black trans body. I don't know how many Black trans bodies have ever been in the Supreme Court room. I was there listening to, honestly, to hear any of the justices speak felt like I was witnessing history, even if I disagreed with what they were saying. Obviously, hearing Ruth Bader Ginsburg was an experience. And having the opportunity to hear our case, and when I say our cases, I mean the 3 cases that were being argued, it was a very unusual balance between feeling proud that there was an acknowledgement of LGBTQIA existence in this very official historic space, but also it felt like an attack when hearing the other side, the opposing side, lay out their reasons why we don't deserve any rights, basically. And so that was very tough to hear. And then having the opportunity to meet with Amy Stevens, who passed recently. She's not the only plaintiff in the 3 cases that passed, 2 of them have died. But to be able to meet with her and look into her eyes and realize that this is actually something that I realized during the Roe v. Wade case, which I don't remember, but watching the Netflix movie, or I think it was on Netflix, Jane Roe, this is someone who became a symbol of this court case, and her story was used nationally to demonstrate and argue workplace discrimination for LGBT people, and she never got to see that decision. She never necessarily reaped the benefits of that decision. It's the same as in the Roe versus Wade case. So I just thought that was an interesting parallel. But I spent a couple of months being worried that because we have a primarily conservative Supreme Court, that we would not get the news that we wanted. And I knew, just based on the schedule, that it always seems like these LGBT decisions just happen to come in June. But I think, as it's been explained to me, the way that this usually works is that these decisions, they're on a schedule, and June is the deadline, like the end of the month is the deadline. So the bigger cases, they end up pushing towards the end of their calendar year, which is June. But there was 2 weeks ago where I was saying, after the president's tweet on HHS, restrictions for transgender people, everything that's happening with Black Lives Matter, I cannot take a Supreme Court decision that allows people to discriminate against us by not hiring us or firing us for who we are. And thank goodness that didn't happen.
Yeah. I'm going to turn this over to some audience questions. One of them is by anonymous, but they want David to give a preview. I was going to ask you about this as well, of your upcoming documentary about COVID-19 and what
Oh,
that's
wow.
all about.
Well, that's a very nice question, and thank you for that. I'm going to demur and not say too much about it. It's a film I'm working on with HBO, and I'm just in the early stages of it. But I will tell you that it involves a pandemic,
All right.
and hopefully involves surviving a plague.
You think it's going to be titled
Yeah.
The Plague 2 or?
Well, I hope it has as happy an ending.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I'll ask a question of my own. There's a big disconnect, obviously, between generations when it comes to the AIDS, HIV crisis. And I can talk from experience, if I'm being perfectly honest. Your film taught me a lot. Do either of you feel that there's an uptick in interest of the AIDS crisis given what's going on in the world today? Have either of you experienced that?
I'll jump in quickly if I might. As we were saying before, obviously people want people are desperate for information that would help them feel empowered, that would help give them hope, that would help give them information about what the future might look like.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the HIV/AIDS movement does that. When I was making the film, I kept saying it was going to be the world's first feel-good AIDS movie. Because there was so much good that came out of the AIDS movement and even the darkest days of the epidemic. And so, yeah, I think that people are turning to previous times in history for emblems of success, and not just to the AIDS movement, but the same way the AIDS movement turned to movements before it for ideas about ways to feel like that you could find that sort of power. And those movements were like the feminist movement, the women's health movement, the civil rights movement, obviously, the anti-war movement. So much that came before the AIDS crisis informed the response to that crisis. And today, more than ever, people are feeling really powerless.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for us to know that there were times when people felt powerless and they were able to find a way not only to create power, but to use it in really positive ways to not only guarantee survival, but to make sure that the thing that we survive into is totally transformed by.
Yeah, I definitely remember witnessing sort of that disparate energy between the two different groups of what generations, I should say. I remember growing up in the 90s and being up, I know we've all heard the stories about, fear of not only AIDS and HIV, but fear of sex. And with or without a condom, and just kind of thinking about new ways to relate to each other that didn't necessarily involve sex at all, was definitely something that I know was on the minds of other queer people when in the 90s that were in my age group. And I definitely remember celebrating the different milestones that we've had throughout the years with regards to science and medication, with social stigma shifting. I won't say going down, but shifting, and being able to witness that ebb and flow. And I remember feeling very encouraged about the future years ago, the future of whatever this virus, however this virus would fit with humanity, at least in America. But the sort of marketing of the ideas around HIV, AIDS and HIV, and the stigma are very different than the reality of what the lived experiences of the people who are in marginalized communities, both in this country, but then also in Africa. And to know that we've made so many advances, but fallen so far behind and fallen so short, again, shows and highlights the disparity between where we say we are and where we really are with regards to everyone else that we're leaving behind. It became really clear to me when I was working in one of my shows in New York City, and someone came up to me who looked like they were just a baby, maybe 18 or 19, should have been 21, but whatever. And disclosed to me that they had seroconverted and that they were HIV positive. Wow. And I remember being confused for a moment and kind of thinking, oh, you know, how? Like I thought we were, you know, how did this jump my generation? Mm-hmm. And, you know, I thought at least you as a younger person would have at least the same, if not more, knowledge about all of these things and how to deal with them or how to avoid this or that. You know, and that wasn't from a stigma standpoint. That was just like, what information did I get that you didn't get? Yeah. And I think that's apparent because the AIDS and HIV education has gone down in public schools over the past several years. And so there's not really a wonder why, it's not a mystery, but I was discouraged by that. I am now, though, encouraged more at the conversation and discourse that younger people are having around AIDS and HIV. And so I think that it does have a good, the next chapter is a better story.
And to close this out, maybe on an optimistic note or maybe not, but it's a question from someone on the call. They're asking if you're both optimistic about the future. I'll let either of you go first.
I want to hear what made Peppermint laugh.
Yeah, you know, I am. I mean, that is a loaded little comment question. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I am optimistic about the future when it comes to AIDS and HIV. I think we are having the conversation more, and we are having a more nuanced conversation than we ever have in the past. And so the fruit of that must be something good, hopefully. With regards to just the general future, I do think that, again, we're in a moment in time right now of extreme change. And I think one of the notions that seems to be more widely talked about is the notion of intersectionality. When we talk about AIDS and HIV and how the effects of it, we have to talk about race and class. We have to talk about nationality. We have to talk about gender. We have to talk about, and sexuality, obviously. We have to talk about all of these things and how there are different points for different people. And so the result is going to be different. And I think gone are the days where we were using a one-size-fits-all description of, when we're talking about AIDS affects gay men, well, who's that? And AIDS affects Americans, who's that? Is that a white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed man who's a banker? What's that mean? And I think the answer to that question would have been yes, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. But now we're seeing that the answer to that question is much more nuanced. And so I think I'm optimistic about the future.
That's great.
That was a beautiful answer. I think I've already said about, shared about how much hope I have in the movement for Black Lives that's seized this moment to try and find ways to chart a course for us to get through this. That will bring us not back to the old America, but forward to a new America. And I'm so excited about that. But I want to talk just a little bit about the amount of work that still needs to be done in HIV and AIDS in America. There are still 7,000, 8,000 deaths every year from AIDS. In America, there should not be any. It should not be a fatal disease. There are still thousands of transmissions every year. It's an uncontained epidemic in America. It's still a queer epidemic, but it's almost entirely an epidemic now among African American and transgender young people, mostly in the American South, where we have never created a pathway or a bridge to healthcare for Black and Brown queer people in that part of America. They're entirely disconnected from the healthcare universe. We have wonderful messages about HIV and AIDS prevention. We've got wonderful approaches. We've got what they call a toolbox now to prevent HIV in ways that could actually, if everybody had access to that toolbox, which includes condoms, which includes PrEP, which includes a million other approaches to making sure that one stays healthy, we could actually end AIDS in America. We could end it, and we haven't done it. We haven't gotten close to doing it, and we haven't really extended our safety net in any way to that would allow us to even fantasize about the promise of that. This pandemic has shown us so much about what hasn't been done in public health and in healthcare and in health services in America. We've got to learn from all of these failures and not accept them in the future. And my hope is that we can build an America, a new America, that would address the HIV/AIDS pandemic finally and permanently in America, to make it so that nobody is falling victim to a containable and a treatable virus.
Well, thank you so much, David and Ms. Peppermint, for taking part in today's really important conversation. And for all of you watching, in case you haven't seen the film or you want to rewatch How to Survive a Plague, as I said before, it's available to stream for free for the time being on IFC Films Unlimited, which you can find on Apple and Amazon. So thank you, David and Peppermint, yet again, and have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
David, thank you so much for your beautiful film. It's just a seminal piece of history, and you pulling together and curating all of this and laying it out in such a beautiful way has been so entertaining and definitely life-changing. It's a coincidence I'm here with you because I was talking about it in a video only a few weeks ago. And so thank you.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Peppermint, for doing this. And thank you for those incredibly kind words. And thanks to Nigel, thanks to IFC for making this film available. Thanks to this audience for showing up and joining us, and the people who came to have this conversation with us. It was really valuable and very challenging and very interesting. I really appreciate it. Thank you all.